All right, welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government. My name is Ken Hicks. We've been dealing with the issue of public opinion and why public opinion is important in democratic societies. You would ideally like to think that politicians want to be responsive to the public will. The problem is that the public is, first and foremost, we have this idea of a national sentiment, and then we have the reality that we are carved up into 50 states of vastly differing sizes that live in, fundamentally different within different subcultures that lend people, that give, kind of socialize people into different beliefs. And so it's really hard to say at any particular point in time what the public will is on certain issues. I think I mentioned in the last class that public opinion on, for example, issues like abortion has actually been fairly stable over nearly a half a century. It's really been kind of a majority of Americans that believe that women should have reproductive rights of some kind. But Americans generally express a kind of ambivalence about abortion. The death penalty, the issues tend to vacillate quite a bit. We are a little bit over a month away from the 2024 presidential elections. And as a practical matter, it's really hard to say definitively who's going to win. There's a ton of polling out there suggesting that Kamala Harris, the Democratic nominee, has a small lead in national polls and has a similarly small lead in a number of the what we call battleground states, those states where they're typically more competitive than typical states. If she were to win those that combination of states that Democrats generally carry, along with states like North Carolina and Georgia and Arizona and Nevada and Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, then she's going to win the presidency relatively handily. Why don't we know beforehand? And the answer to that is something that it's actually a fairly recent kind of addition to the rhetoric, to American rhetoric about politics. And that is where people say that polls are indicative, not, they're not necessarily conclusive. They're not predictive, in other words. And why is that? Well, there are a number of factors. Polling is, polling on especially elections and things like that is kind of like predicting the weather. Weather people have very sophisticated models, and they're generally pretty good at getting a general idea of when you're going to get weather, when a front may come through. But there are certain factors that are sort of beyond weather people's control. The same thing is true with pollsters. And the main question that they have to address is turnout. How many Americans will actually exercise their civic duty and either vote by absentee ballot ahead of time, engage in early voting, or show up on election day and actually, fill out a ballot on November 5th. And so that is the challenge that you confront as a pollster, is in knowing, is it going to be a high turnout event? Presidential elections in the United States have turnouts anywhere from 68 to upwards of 75%. 75% would be a high turnout election. I think most political scientists and election forecasters would tell you that if turnout is very high, that probably bodes well for Kamala Harris. On the other hand, if turnout is low, then it would probably be to the advantage of Donald Trump. And that's because of some consistent things in the electorate, that there are more what we call casual voters, people that sometimes show up and sometimes don't. There are more casual voters in the Democratic coalition than there are in the Republican coalition. And we'll talk more about this next week when we get to the media, and then in the week after that, we're going to be dealing with with campaigns, voting, and elections, along with political parties and other relevant issues. And so you have to estimate how many people are going to turn out and how many of those people are going to be Republicans, Democrats, and independents. And then you have to have that idea as to how independents are going to break. And so a lot of this early polling helps them model. First, they'll ask questions about, first of all, demographic issues. Are you a Democrat? Do you self-identify as a Democrat? They'll do questions that try to get at a voter's partisanship. Among independents, they talk a lot about, for example, likely voters. Are you likely to vote, or are you less likely to vote? So there's still an interesting number of undecided voters that are out there. And I suspect that a lot of those folks are people that are ambivalent about voting. They know who they're going to vote for. They're thinking about voting for Donald Trump, but they are ambivalent about telling people that. And that is one of the reasons why in the elections that Donald Trump has participated in, it has been hard to get a clear model on Donald Trump's base of support. And pollsters in 2016 pretty consistently underestimated the number of people who planned to vote for Donald Trump. And so the fact that voters sometimes are reluctant to share their views. That there's actually I think it was in the late 80s, early 90s, there was a Louisiana governor's race where remarkably a Ku Klux Klansman by the name of David Duke won the Republican nomination for the governor. And there was a Democrat, he was running against a Democrat who was a storied figure in Louisiana politics. And if you don't know much about Louisiana politics, it is spectacularly corrupt. It is one of the most corrupt states of the 50 states, in the Union. And it is just rich with a history of just, incredible, breathtaking venality. And Edwin Edwards was one of the more venal Louisiana politicians. And they had bumper stickers, vote for the crook, because he had been indicted multiple times and had always kind of survived. Said vote for the crook. It's important. And polling leading up to that election suggested that Edwin Edwards was going to win by more than 20 points. And then election day came. He barely squeaked out a victory. I think he won by less than 2%. And pollsters were just, stunned at how their models had not captured the number of people who were preparing to vote for a known member of the Ku Klux Klan because he was a Republican. And that was kind of early in that period where you had actually had a fundamental realignment of Southern voter sentiments, and to the point where, again, we oftentimes ignore the extent to which our politics and political participation are extra rational. They're not. People are acting on something other than their just pure reason. And this was one of those instances where where voters knew that what they were doing was going to subject them to criticism, and so they simply were not being honest with pollsters. And so that's, again, another kind of illustration of the difficulties of conducting accurate polls. A part of it is, simply we don't know how many people are going to follow through and actually show up and vote. And we're not completely sure that the people that we're polling are being entirely honest with us. And so that is a real challenge. Another problem that we'll talk about in a few minutes is that, the primary mode of contact for pollsters are telephones. And a vanishingly small number of people these days actually have landlines, and it's simply harder to get to people who have cell phones. And so, again, there is a question of how representative a poll is. So what are we going to talk about today? We're going to continue discussion of how we form opinions. And then we're going to talk a little bit about how public opinion can shape government policy, and also how oftentimes government policy can be resistant to public opinion. We're going to talk about the importance of measuring public opinion, and again, the challenges associated with accurately measuring public opinion. Then we'll conclude with just some questions, what we think about public opinion. So how do we go about forming public opinions? And we've talked about family, we've talked about friends. I think everybody, I was kind of like a political junkie when I was in college. I was planning to be a lawyer. The more I learned about being a lawyer, the less convinced I was that I really wanted to be. You get those uncomfortable questions when you're a young teen. What are you going to be when you grow up? What are you going to be? What are you going to do with your life? And kids hate those questions. And my pat response was, well, I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to go to law school, and I'm going to become a lawyer. I think I still could have done it. I think I would have been happy as a constitutional lawyer, which would have been basically what I'm doing today. I would have probably gotten a Juris Doctorate, and I probably would have found a way onto a law school, faculty, and I would have taught constitutional law, which I think would be a lot of fun. But it is what it is. And so, we talk about things like, the professions that we adopt as having an impact. If you become a political scientist, most of us at some level believe that government is a necessary thing, and that it can be done better or worse depending on how you approach governing. And that's again, one of those things that inclines people to certain kinds of political attitudes. Most political scientists are, what I jokingly call goo-goos, which was a phrase that they used to label progressive era reformers, goo-goos, short for good government. So let's talk a little bit more about the different kinds of socializing forces that act on us and shape, who we become. Political leaders, all government officials make serious attempts to influence public opinion. We recently had a terrible Hurricane Helene, that swept up through Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas, devastated some mountain communities in North Carolina. And don't you want to bet that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris are all over those states? Why? Because as president, if you are not seen showing concern after American communities are devastated by a natural disaster, then it reflects poorly on you. I'll give you a great example of that. During the administration of George W. Bush, there was a terrible hurricane that hit New Orleans. New Orleans was underwater. People were dying. Power was out. Communities were flooded. People were, stranded on rooftops. And George W. Bush, who had been in California on a fundraising trip, there's a famous picture of him on Air Force One peering out of Air Force One, looking down as they flew over New Orleans. That photo did not work for George W. Bush. It made him look like he didn't really care. It was compounded, that perception, by the Federal Emergency Management Administration's really disjointed, uncoordinated response to that hurricane. And it really, I think it hurt Bush in his second term very badly. It began the cascade of things. There were a number of things. He tried to privatize Social Security in the opening months of his administration and could not even marshal support within the Republican Party for that. You had Hurricane Katrina. That was the hurricane that hit New Orleans. And then, of course, you had the subprime mortgage meltdown. By the time George W. Bush left office, his approval ratings were in the 30s, in the low 30s. And there were a lot of, Republicans lost control of the House of Representatives, and it really, and a lot of it, kind of began with that, bungled response to Hurricane Katrina. So it's not surprising that a great deal of presidential staffing is devoted to messaging, to shaping public opinion. And again, part of the reason for that is that as you get into the 20th century, presidents and their ability to maintain support, keep in mind, and we'll talk more about this when we get to our presentations on the presidency, the key to presidential power is persuasion. You have to persuade people in order to get anything done as a president, in order to be able to lead. And the essence of persuasion is again, public approval. If you're underwater in public approval, if your public approval rating is less than 50%, your opponents in Congress have little incentive to work with you. Okay? One of the early illustrations of the power of leaders to influence people occurred during the Great Depression, and again in the darkest days of the Great Depression in the early 1930s, right after the presidential election of 1932. The administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt had made the decision that they were going to make a series of public addresses to the nation via radio. In the 1930s, radio was the dominant sort of medium of communication, of political communication. And the Roosevelt administration made a very cagey decision to air these what became known as fireside chats right after Will Rogers' radio program, which was the most popular program in the United States at that time. It commanded a huge audience. And so, the first fireside chat, Roosevelt, very calmly addressed the nation about the banking crisis and the actions that, that the administration was taking to try and deal with the banking crisis. And, the first thing he did was, he said, don't try to withdraw your money. Have a little faith in the federal government. We will preserve the money. Because again, back in those days, when there was a fear among Americans that the bank that they had their money in was about to fail, they would all run to the bank, called a run on the banks, and try to withdraw their deposits. There were people burying money in their backyards, putting money under their mattresses, and Roosevelt was trying to persuade people that was not a good idea, that's not going to save you. And so, that's was an important kind of inflection point, both in terms of, a political leader influencing and reassuring the nation, but also in, again, this idea of political communication generally. Presidents since then have worked very hard to try and mimic, try and put, get that kind of FDR lightning to be able to reassure the public and persuade them that what they want to do is good for them and good for the nation. And I think it's also important in contemporary terms that while Barack Obama was the first president to use Twitter, Trump was the first Twitter president. He was the first president to communicate with his followers predominantly through Twitter, which is an interesting phenomenon. Again, X is again a kind of a superficial form of communication where you're limited to how many characters you can tweet at any particular point in time. But it does a really it clearly exerted a powerful effect over Americans. Donald Trump, in fact, yesterday, today is Thursday as I'm airing this, the special counsel that is attempting to prosecute Donald Trump for events surrounding January 6th, the judge in that case in the District of Columbia released basically a redacted version of the 165-page refutation that Trump's actions were official in nature, and therefore that he was immune from prosecution. And a lot of that evidence comes from Twitter, comes from his use of Twitter during the Capitol riots. He was in the White House for hours watching Fox News and actively engaging with Twitter at that time. And so, that is being used against him as evidence, both that he knew what he was doing and that he knew the influence that he had over the public, over the people who had invaded the Capitol and who were chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," and that what he was doing was in no way part of his official duties. And so, again, we follow our leaders oftentimes for good or ill. Political knowledge is an important source of people's political attitudes and how we become socialized. A person's level of education and the nature of that education will oftentimes have a profound effect on how they address new information and on the political opinions they form. It's often, the argument often is that, especially among critics of education, that education is indoctrination. That's simply not true. Even as a political scientist, I'm teaching a politically loaded subject. Nevertheless, I don't believe I have ever converted a student from one political perspective to another. That's simply not how it works. Most kids, even traditional freshmen that walk into one of my classes at 17 or 18 years old, or maybe 19 years old, already typically have fully formed ideological perspectives that are far more resistant to, people, you think that people are really impressionable and that they're just these tabula rasas and I can simply stamp, my ideology on them and that they will accept it uncritically. That's simply not my experience, and I doubt that it's the experience of many other political scientists or other people in the humanities. Kids come into our classes with their beliefs, and they generally exit the classrooms with their beliefs pretty much intact. What a college education can do is give you a discipline. It gives you an approach. How do I go about gathering information? How do I weigh the veracity of information? It gives you critical thinking skills that oftentimes will make you a more moderate person. If you are, naturally more of a liberal bent, it will tend to cause you to look and see what the other side is thinking before you leap to conclusions. One of the most important things that you learn in college is how to suspend belief or to suspend judgment until you have enough information. That's an important, kind of skill to remain impartial until you get, what seems to you like enough information to form a reasoned belief about a subject. So knowledgeable citizens are generally better evaluators of new information and are more resistant to misinformation. And the challenge that we confront in American politics today is that the median American voter is typically a low information voter. A significant, over a third of Americans don't really begin paying attention to elections until the final month of a campaign season. And very frequently, these are folks who, for whatever reason, are either disinterested or simply find politics to be distasteful. And so very often these folks don't do enough to really inform themselves before they exercise their franchise. I would also note that a lot of, it really depends on what kind of education you get in terms of how it influences your political perspective. There are lots and lots of college degrees in things like business and accounting and, medical degrees that don't really touch on a person's ideological perspective. And many of those folks they have advanced degrees and are nevertheless quite conservative. The late Oklahoma Senator Tom Coburn was an OBGYN. He delivered babies, was one of the most conservative senators in American history. And so it really depends on the nature of the education you're getting. Trust in government is, this is a kind of a comparative thing. What factors do you think might explain why citizens of some countries have more confidence in their government than others? What are the political consequences of large percentages of citizens having high versus low levels of trust in government? In the United States, responses about trust show a strong correlation with what we call negative partisanship, which is, again, this idea that I don't necessarily support one party because I love that party, but I support that party because I hate the other party. So when you look at the United States, less than 50% of Americans that are surveyed, express trust in the government. Countries that have the highest amount of trust: Switzerland, Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Germany. Do those countries, think about the geographic location of those countries. They're all in Northern Europe, right? They all have what we might call social democratic governments, where there is a great deal of government intervention to ensure that people have plenty of resources. In most of those countries that I just mentioned, they have paid maternity leave. They have national health insurance. In Norway, Finland, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, they all have government-sponsored vacations where the government will pay to send you anywhere you want to go in the world. Many of those places, Denmark is routinely listed as among the happiest nations, citizens in the world. What is it about Denmark that makes the people of Denmark so consistently content with their lives? I think that's an interesting question to ask. Something that people ought to think about. Why is trust in the United States so low? A significant part of it is that for, going back to the 1960s, we have had a consistent investment of hundreds of billions of dollars by very wealthy Americans who have done everything in their power to undermine faith in the federal government, either because they don't want regulatory policies, or they want lower taxes, or they want, they want the erosion of civil rights and civil liberties. In many instances, it's because they want the United States to become a more Christian nation and follow the particular religious dictates that whatever billionaire happens to embrace those views seems to think is important to them. That is the essence of the culture war. Culture wars, like real wars, don't just start organically. People start wars. So Americans rely on, they have an approach to news gathering. I can tell you my approach. I generally spend every morning, I look at headlines and I read stories out of the Washington Post and the New York Times and about a half a dozen other news oriented sites. I would do the Wall Street Journal, but it's too expensive. And so, Many Americans rely on elite cues from trusted leaders. A lot of Republicans follow the lead of Donald Trump. A lot of Democrats continue to extend a great deal of reverence and affection for Barack Obama. When you think of Black Americans, Barack Obama is absolutely a revered figure. Why? He was the first Black president. He was the first, Black president to serve 2 terms in office. Very importantly, he was the first Black president to exit from politics without having any kind of really serious scandal. He was a prudent, pragmatic leader. A lot of Democrats continue to think very highly of him, and he tries to use that to his advantage. He is campaigning right now very aggressively for Kamala Harris. Why? Well, because Kamala Harris campaigned for him when she was a young prosecutor in California in 2008. She worked on his campaign. So part of the problem is that all too often Americans place exaggerated faith in partisan leaders, and that tends to feed and intensify partisan polarization. When you think about, for example, Donald Trump in that debate with Kamala Harris, when he blurted out, "They're eating the dogs, they're eating the cats." He was talking about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio. There's no evidence that that's the case. The Republican mayor of Springfield, Ohio said that's not happening. Law enforcement, the city manager of Springfield said there have been no reports that are credible that this sort of thing is happening. Law enforcement has reported we're not investigating any crimes that have been alleged involving Haitian immigrants and household pets. J.D. Vance started that rumor and extended that rumor, continues describing those Haitian immigrants who were here legally as illegal aliens. Why? Because that's what they're campaigning on. They're campaigning on, the nation is flooded with immigrants and they're a threat to the American way of life. Never mind that, on average, undocumented immigrants commit fewer crimes than American citizens. Why? Because they don't want to be brought to the attention of law enforcement. They want to work, they want to make money, they want to try to find their way through life, make enough money to go, to get their families into the country. Yes, they do. They want to come to the United States. Why? Because there's jobs here. And because there are not drug gangs that are trying to kill them, kill their children, sell their daughters into sexual, into prostitution, force their children to become drug dealers. They want to get out of those situations in Honduras and Guatemala and Nicaragua and Venezuela. So by encouraging Americans to jump to conclusions, polarization oftentimes has the effect of reducing overall levels of political knowledge, because misinformation is replacing accurate information. And when you are acting on the basis of inaccurate information, again, there was a focus group, and one of the guys that said he was undecided but clearly wasn't, he was going to vote for Donald Trump, said, "My main issue is all these immigrants flooding into the country." Well, right now immigration is actually been undocumented people crossing the border has sharply reduced. Right at this particular moment. He doesn't think Kamala Harris is going to do anything. Why? Well, because he wants to do what Donald Trump wants to do, which is a bunch of stuff like building a wall it's going to have symbolic value, but isn't really going to stop undocumented immigrants. Most people who come into this country come on temporary visas and then overstay their welcome. Most people who are here trying to get refugee status. Whether they can effectively get that or not is another question. That's another aspect of our law that needs to be addressed by Congress. But no one is really doing those things, doing the hard work of legislating and figuring out how we should deal with refugees. Americans oftentimes engage in skim and scan strategies, right? More Americans are getting their news online. More Americans are getting their news from social media. And again, the problem there is that social media like Facebook and Twitter are gobbling up the advertising, but they don't feel any obligation to hew to journalistic principles. And so again, you're getting a lot more misinformation that is getting in front of people. When you are just walking along, looking at your phone, scanning headlines, you're not doing the things you need to do as a citizen to fully understand an issue. All you're doing is reading the headline. The headline doesn't really tell you that much about an issue. Increasingly, because all the news organizations have online components, there is a trend towards shorter articles with flashier headlines. The point of everything is to draw your eye. Because again, these days advertising is more about how long you're spending on a website as opposed to how large your audience is. So are Americans well informed if their news gathering consists of simply scanning a headline? There's a really good book, again, written in the 1980s, 1986 or 7, by Neil Postman called Amusing Ourselves to Death, where he basically said the transition from being a newspaper reading culture to a television watching culture has negative implications for democracy, because it converts the news, something that we felt a civic obligation to learn about when we read newspapers, into a form of entertainment. And increasingly, again, it's not just the television, it's the clicker, right? You can just switch the channel. And so increasingly people are treating politics and political information as a form of entertainment. Is that good for democracy? I think the answer is it's on average probably not great, right? Again, there's much greater ease of access. That doesn't necessarily mean that people are better informed than they were in an earlier age. And it's interesting that in many other countries, people are better informed, in part because the political parties get subsidies from the government to do programming, to do outreach to the public. So what are the costs to democracy? Low information voters are easier to manipulate. People lacking political knowledge struggle to identify their interests, and so have greater difficulty voting in ways that protect their interests. And again, I think the politicized response to the COVID-19 pandemic illustrate the consequences of a low information society. Too many Americans, first of all, everybody became a virologist or an immunologist. Everybody thought they were a public health expert within a month or two of the lockdowns. And you had lots and lots of people saying, keep the schools open because the kids aren't, vulnerable to COVID. But teachers are. And, teachers have many of the kinds of comorbidities that made them very vulnerable to COVID-19. COVID-19 killed about 2% of the people that contracted it. That's not a particularly virulent disease. The problem is it was incredibly communicable because you contracted it via the air, right? So 2% of 100 million people is a lot of people that are going to die as a result of this. And so public health officials, the response going all the way back to the Black Plague is that when you have these kinds of diseases, you have to shelter in place for a period of time until or unless you get a vaccine. A lot of people, and again, they were led in that direction by political leaders. A lot of Americans thought that a malarial drug, was somehow going to, this miracle, disease, cure for COVID. A lot of people fell in with ivermectin, which is, it's a horse pill, but it also works with humans, if you get worms or something like that. And a lot of people thought that taking ivermectin was somehow efficacious for the drug, for treating COVID-19. Part of that was furthered by an online podcaster by the name of Joe Rogan, who caught COVID and said he took ivermectin, and he threw everything at it, and he was cured somehow. There were people within the medical profession that were pushing these kinds of miracle cures. I can't remember what it was. Frontline Doctors was one of them, where again these were people who were seeking to make profits. They were attempting to monetize their expertise against the what was widely understood to be the consensus of the medical community. Some of these folks actually lost their medical licenses because they were effectively pushing misinformation during COVID-19. And part of that stems from the fact that the worst aspect of COVID-19 was it happened in the midst of a presidential election year. And if Donald Trump had simply responded soberly to the COVID-19 crisis, he probably would have won re-election. Instead, he tried to push responsibility for the COVID response down to the states and say the federal government has no role to play, and tried to avoid blame. And I think a lot of Americans held him, in the end in 2020, voted against him as much as voted for Joe Biden. There's another illustration of negative partisanship. So public opinion can shape government policy, okay? So given what we've learned to this point about low levels of political information among Americans, we shouldn't be surprised when politicians yield to the temptation of attempting to manipulate the public to support their preferred policies rather than to seek to respond to clearly expressed preferences of public sentiment. However, in a democracy, taking public opinion seriously is a duty rather than some optional guidance that can be followed or discarded according to a politician's whim. I mentioned in following the 2004 presidential elections, George W. Bush made a bold. He said, I won political capital and I'm going to do something with it. And what I want to do is to privatize Social Security. And he went about, he pushed a plan to basically convert Social Security, which is again one of the major pillars of American welfare politics, to convert it to a private program, which is to say, get the federal government out. He would have effectively gotten rid of the Social Security Administration and allowed, financiers to manage the money of Social Security recipients. Now, the argument there is this kind of shareholder argument that suddenly you're going to have all this money in the marketplace. But if you do that, you're also exposing that trust, that trillions of dollars to the vicissitudes of the investment, of Wall Street, investment bankers. Chile did something similar to that, and when they've had financial, crises or financial scandals, it's the retirees in Chile's, equivalent of Social Security that end up paying, that end up suffering, and government periodically has to intervene in those kinds of things and make retirees whole. He ultimately failed, despite a 6-month campaign to try and shift public opinion. And some of the people that resisted this the most and were most hostile to Bush's proposed reforms were elderly people, and who he made a pitch. He kept saying over and over again, we're going to grandfather this. People who now are on Social Security will remain on Social Security. In typical George W. Bush fashion, you'll still get your checks. Was kind of his argument. But elderly people, when pollsters talked to them, they very clearly said, I think you're trying to take this away from my grandchildren, and I don't want to see that. Social Security is the best thing to me about the federal government, right? And so, that's an illustration of how a leader thought he could somehow shift public opinion in favor of a preferred policy, and ultimately ended up squandering a great deal of political capital. So how responsive is the government to public opinion? Studies show that under the right conditions, politicians are highly sensitive to public preferences. They, in instances where they know what the public is thinking, and where the public has a clearly articulable preference on an issue, they want to be on the right side of that issue. So the problem is the relationship between government responsiveness and public opinion is dynamic, okay? For a variety of reasons, public opinion and policy often do not align. And part of that is the increasingly winner-take-all nature of American politics. Now, one classic illustration of public policy just rapidly shifting in response to public opinion are the no smoking areas now in restaurants. It used to be most restaurants had allowed smoking, especially in the bar area. And of course the problem is anybody that's got a breathing problem, anybody that if you're a waitress and you are working in the area where there's a lot of smoking going on, it's going to affect your lungs. And there are a lot of children are in restaurants, and what we began to increasingly recognize is that smoking is a health problem, not simply for the smokers. People. I remember working in restaurants when I was in college, and the next day I would smell gross. My bed sheet smelled like nicotine. I would be coughing because of all the secondhand smoke I inhaled. And so really over the span of a couple of years, not in the not too distant past, public policy shifted on smoking in places like restaurants. And so it's simply no longer allowed. You have to be outside if you want to smoke. And the same thing, goes for here on campuses. We have a smoke-free campus. If you want to smoke, you've got to go outside of buildings. And I think that's good policy. Does everyone's opinion count equally? I think, of course, in democracy, the theory is, one person, one vote. But the reality is that we are, a democratic society. We are also a capitalist economy. And people with more money can make their opinion felt far more effectively than can the poor. So evidence shows that politicians are far more responsive to donors and wealthy constituents than they are to low-income constituents. I love this quote. It's from a French literary figure by the name of Anatole France. In its majestic equality, the law forbids the rich and poor alike to sleep under bridges, beg in the streets, and steal loaves of bread. And again, the idea is, the irony is, well, the rich don't do those things because they're not compelled to, right? When we think about, homelessness, the rich generally don't, leave their mansions and start sleeping under bridges, and they don't beg in the streets. They don't feel that need, and in most instances, they don't have the mental stresses that push people into homeless conditions. And so it reflects the reality that the law disproportionately punishes the behavior of the poor more so than it does the very wealthy. If you look at the difficulties that have been inherent in prosecuting Donald Trump for the various criminal actions that he is publicly alleged to have committed, you get the sense that when you rise to a certain position in society, you become very nearly prosecution proof. I think there is clear evidence that had Donald Trump not clearly decided that he was going to run for president again, that the Biden administration, that the Justice Department would not have filed charges against him, that he would have effectively committed the various crimes that he's alleged to have committed. And again, he's innocent until proven guilty. But he would never have likely been indicted on any of those crimes, which again reflects America's deep ambivalence about the challenges inherent in holding someone who is a political, a holder of elected office, responsible for criminal behavior. We recently have had the indictments of a sitting U.S. Senator, Menendez of New Jersey, and we've recently had the indictment of New York City Mayor Adams. Both of them are Democrats. So this DOJ, this Department of Justice, has gone after both Republicans and Democrats. But there is an ambivalence within the legal community about that, because there are very real fears that the wall between politics and criminal justice can erode, and that we can find ourselves suddenly with the law being used as a political cudgel against dissident, against political opponents of the wealthy and powerful. That's a dangerous place to be. We've seen that in other societies where the law is used. In Russia, Vladimir Putin has been very effective at accusing people opposing him in elections of crimes and imprisoning them. I don't think we want to go down that road. So how do we know public opinion? We know it via the process of surveying and polling, right? Politicians spend a lot of time and money studying public opinion polls because they need to know which issues command majority support and align themselves with the public on those specific issues. Additionally, aspiring politicians contract with pollsters to decide whether they have sufficient name recognition to run for office. Politicians run polls to identify policies their constituents are more likely to support and which kinds of appeals the public is most likely to respond favorably to. I will tell you right now, most Republicans, and you can see this if you look both at the Trump-Harris debate and also the Vance-Walz debate. Republicans are deeply uncomfortable discussing the issue of abortion right now because they know that while abortion is a very popular issue with their voters, it is not a majority issue. It is the kind of, we call it a wedge issue, where it puts them in positions where they are shedding support of especially many conservative women because pretty strong majorities of women support women's reproductive rights. And there are too many instances. They're trying right now to say, well, it's Democrats that have the extreme position on abortion. But I think the public broadly thinks that they're on the wrong side of that issue, and so it's not an issue that they really like to talk about. So surveys are an important way of scientifically approaching the study of public opinion. So it's really not feasible to poll 343 or however many million Americans there are in the United States at any particular point in time. It would cost way too much money, would take way too long. So scientific public opinion polling began in the 1930s with a guy named George Gallup. He was very accurate. He founded the Gallup Corporation, the Gallup poll. And so he basically tapped into the idea of statistical sampling, okay? So in order to get an accurate sample, you have to make sure you understand the dimensions of the universe the universe of people you're trying to measure. And then you have to try to identify what is known as a random stratified sample of that universe of people. So what does it mean to say randomness? A random sample is truly random if everyone within the universe has the same opportunity of being selected for the treatment, to be exposed to the poll, to be surveyed. Stratification refers to, again, it's something that I was talking about at the start of this class, and that is making sure that you have accurately represented in the right proportion the number of kind of demographic features that we know tend to be indicative of people's positions, of people's political viewpoints. Again, what are some of those issues? Race, ethnicity, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, age, right? All of these are things that you have to take into account when you are putting together a survey sample, which is again a sample of it's a smaller grouping of a larger universe. And again, the fundamental question is, how representative are the samples that you're drawing? So samples have to be large enough to accurately model the universe. And what we found is that there's actually a law of diminishing returns. Once you get to around 1,200, you're getting a sample size that is probably ideal in terms both of you're getting a margin of error that's plus minus 3.1%. Now you can get a larger sample and that can reduce your margin of error. And again, what is the margin of error? It's the likelihood that you're wrong in either direction, right? So really when you're looking at a margin of error of around 3.1, that means you could be off at 3 points in one direction, 3 points in another direction. So it's almost 6 points that you may be off, right? And so you can go up to 1,200. That'll get your margin of error down a little bit below 3%. The problem is the larger your sample, the smaller is the reduction in your margin of error. And the more time and expense it is in putting together the survey, okay? So the margin of error is very important. And again, when I said that polling is indicative, not predictive, part of the problem, if you look at all these battleground states, and remember, we don't vote nationally. It doesn't matter whether Kamala Harris wins 2, 3, or even 6 million more votes overall. What matters is whether she wins critical elections in Nevada, in Arizona, in Georgia, in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in these battleground states. So if she wins those combinations, and again, in those states, it's basically a dead heat. They're all within the margin of error. So that's why these guys are working like dogs right now. They don't want to leave anything on the table. They want to work as hard as they can over this last month again, right after the vice presidential debate, Tim Walz went to central Pennsylvania. Now, there's not a lot of Democratic voters in central Pennsylvania. The former Democratic consultant, James Carville, once said that Pennsylvania politics is Philly in the east and Pittsburgh in the west and Alabama in between. What's important for Tim Walz is his ability to get those few Democrats in those areas to vote, because that reduces Trump's margins in those areas of Pennsylvania where he needs to run up big margins. Okay, so if there is strong, if there is strong, enthusiastic turnout in rural parts of Pennsylvania for Democrats, that means first of all, overall, you're going to see higher turnout. And again, I believe that a higher turnout event is going to work to the favor of Kamala Harris. So they are attempting to activate voters wherever they can find them. Even if they're not going to, even if they don't think that they're going to win a particular county or a particular region of a state, they don't want to leave anything on the table. They want to get into those areas and appeal and get those people fired up. Another important question that relates to accurate polling are how questions are worded, right? So a lot of times what we found is in polling, when you ask people whether you think that enough money is being spent on certain, kind of welfare-related programs, when you use the word welfare, it affects the way people perceive those programs, right? So if you phrase the question more generally, do you think that enough is being done to help people who are poor? You'll get a given kind of response. Do you think that enough is spent on welfare? Gets you a very different response. Likewise with abortion, when you look at, when you say, if you have a question, for example, that says, do you favor women's reproductive rights? That's sufficiently vague that even someone who is a staunch opponent of abortion could say that they support women's reproductive rights, right? To the extent that they're saying effectively, I believe that women should not be allowed, that rape is wrong, and that women should have a right to determine, their partners and things like that. It doesn't necessarily get to the question of abortion. Likewise, if you phrase the question, do you support the murder of unborn innocent babies? Well, even some people who believe that women have the right to abortion might read that sentence and say, well, no, of course I don't. But then many of those folks are thrown by the idea of babies, right? Not fetus, but babies. When and this is a recent change in the rhetoric of anti-abortion activists. They have started really in the last couple of years to talking about fetuses as babies. Everything at all stages, they're calling it a baby. They're calling a fetus. I shouldn't say it. That's insensitive. They're calling fetuses babies. And that creates an environment where, again, people feel a little bit more ambivalent. And that's where, again, a lot of the tension is within issues that fundamentally deal with privacy. And so how you phrase these questions, certain kinds of words can have very loaded meanings. And so you have to, when you're creating a survey instrument, and a lot of times activists, in the anti-abortion movement, will try to advance their own, public opinion surveys, and they'll use loaded questions like that, and then we now have support for our position because we have phrased these questions in a way that we know we're going to get a certain kind of response. So when are polls wrong? Again, polls are indicative, not predictive. They're not definitive. There have been a number of instances where pollsters' predictions were not borne out. One of the early, one of the first times, for example, George Gallup proved to be wrong was in the 1936 presidential elections, where a lot of pollsters believed that Franklin Delano Roosevelt's opponent was going to win. So Sorry, I got a message that threw me off for a second. So in a lot of instances, you're going to find that, pollsters get something wrong. For example, in 1932, there was a magazine called the Literary Digest, and they got most of their respondents from automobile registrations and from telephone directories. And 10,000 Americans participated, and they were accurately predicting outcomes right up until 1932. And the problem is the Literary Digest was accurate to the point that people's opinions were not changing, right? And what happened, and part of the problem was that they were basically only polling those people that had cars and telephones. Well, in the 1930s, that's a very skewed sample of Americans, right? And so in the 1930s, those people that didn't have phones and cars, fundamentally, this was a realigning election where a few million Americans, probably 2-3% of American voters, stopped being Republicans and started being Democrats. And that was a critical shift that led to the formation of the New Deal coalition, which dominated American politics for nearly 40 years. Okay. Likewise, in 1948, everybody believed that Harry Truman was going to be defeated in that election. He was not really considered to be a high-profile national politician. Roosevelt had dumped his second vice president, Henry Wallace, for reasons that seemed good to him. And Wallace was running as an independent to the left of FDR. Additionally, Harry Truman was despised by the Dixiecrats, by the Southern Democrats, and they ran a ticket against, on the right. They ran Strom Thurmond and another, I think it was like the governor of Alabama, on what was known as the Dixiecrat ticket, hoping to steal votes from Truman in the South. So Harry Truman understood that he was in trouble, okay? And all the pollsters were predicting that Thomas Dewey, who was the very popular governor of New York, who had run against FDR in '44, that he would comfortably win the presidential election. Well, Truman did something different. He went on a train and he did a whistle-stop tour throughout many of the states of the Northeast, where he decried a do-nothing Congress. Republicans controlled the Congress at that time, and promised a fair deal for Americans. And he put civil rights in the Democratic platform for the first time. Remember, 1948 is very significant in that sense. And he ultimately narrowly defeated Thomas Dewey. And the famous picture of Harry Truman holding up a picture of the Chicago Daily Tribune, it read, "Dewey defeats Truman," because everyone was convinced that Truman was going to lose, that they actually printed the newspapers with the headline that was wrong, saying that Dewey was going to win. So why were polls not really accurate in 2016 and in 2020? And it gets back to what I was talking about a little while ago, and that is a lot of people, there are lots and lots of very proud MAGA people. They wear the red MAGA hats. They have MAGA t-shirts. You know who those people are. There are also lots of Republicans that are, again, motivated primarily by negative partisanship. And these are folks, again, that are saying, I might not like Donald Trump, but I really hate Kamala Harris. I really hate Democrats in general. And so in both instances, what we're seeing is those folks who are kind of ambivalent, but nevertheless are going to hold their nose and pull the lever for Donald Trump, those folks have been underestimated in polling, okay? And so that, both in 2016 and in 2020. Keep in mind, again, national polls were largely accurate. Hillary Clinton won almost 2 million more votes than Donald Trump. In 2020, Joe Biden won almost 7 million more votes than Donald Trump. But the polls in given states really weren't, strictly speaking, all that accurate. So the other, the issue, this relates to the issue of social desirability bias, which again is this idea that people are reluctant to publicly, articulate ideas that they know people will judge them about. You also have the problem of, again, selection bias, which is that literary digest idea. The idea in a lot of polls online, there's a problem of what we call self-selection. Where it's the people that are participating, they may be motivated in a certain way that's not going to be representative. And then of course you've also got the problem of the bandwagon effect, which can result in polls shifting public support for a candidate when there is this broad perception that they're going to win. Hillary Clinton ran her race in 2008 for the presidency as the inevitable candidate. And the problem for her was, as much as she was trying to be the inevitable candidate, Barack Obama was more popular than her, and he ultimately was able to capitalize on that sense of arrogance within the Clinton campaign, and ultimately narrowly won the Democratic nomination in 2008. You can also see again in 2020, Joe Biden kind of benefited from a bandwagon effect. Once he won the South Carolina primary, and once it was clear that black Democrats were going to support him, support just faded away from everybody else and flowed to him. How journalists cover the campaigns is important. Presidential campaigns often lead journalists to fall into what is known as horse race coverage, where again they're focused on polls and they're talking about who's gaining in the polls, who's losing in the polls, whose campaign is flagging, and it has the first and foremost, what do they want to do? They want coverage, right? They want people to be watching the campaign. Boring campaigns are death for journalists. Journalists want to make money for their news organizations, so they want to spur that excitement. So candidates with momentum generally find it easier to raise money, and they also get a lot more free media. They get more media coverage. And so, but that's not, again, oftentimes campaigns end up being about the horse race and not about the issues. Okay? So how do you evaluate a poll? That's an important question. Neil Newhouse, who's a partner and co-founder of Public Opinion Strategies, which is a Republican poll, offers this advice. Who conducted the interview, right? That's important. How did they go about interviewing their subject, right? Is there footage of it? Can you get an idea of the nuances and the body language within it? How many people did they interview? Again, the size of a poll is going to be very important. What confidence do we have in the results? Again, this gets back into the internal mechanisms of the poll. How accurate was the sampling that was done? What was the length of time? The longer a poll takes to conduct, the harder it is to get accurate, because again, the people that were polled earlier might have changed their opinion by then. What survey model mode was used? In what order were questions asked? Again, you need to see the survey instrument, right, to have a clue. And then who conducted the poll? That's important. So what do we think? At times, it's not always clear to identify a dominant public consensus on an issue. So whose preferences should prevail in those circumstances? Whose preferences should prevail when attitudes differ among different social groups? What methods do elected politicians use to understand what the public wants? And what do they do when they hear conflicting messages? The media are an important source of political information for the public. And the amount and diversity of political information has only expanded, if not improved, as politics has increasingly migrated online. Do you think the greater overall ability of information has increased the accuracy of public opinion as we know it? That's what I'm going to close with those questions, and when we come back next week, we're going to address the questions of the media. I'll see you next time.